All right, we're going to continue our discussion of what OSHA is going to check for if they have an inspection that is primarily aimed at silica. They're going to be looking also, as well as the other things we previously mentioned, for symptoms of silicosis in the workplace. They are going to be checking on things like housekeeping and hygiene. They're going to look into employee exposure and medical records. They're also going to be trying to ascertain whether there's any abrasive blasting going on, as well as how that would be being controlled and what safety measures were in place in order to carry out that abrasive blasting. Now, having said that, if OSHA comes looking at a site specifically targeting silica, they may very well expand that inspection beyond just silica. So, for example, if there is a safety violation going on, say someone is doing something they're not supposed to be doing, and OSHA is there to inspect for silica violations, they may expand their inspection beyond just the discussion of silica and address this other situation that they're aware of. So just be aware that because they're coming to check for silica does not mean that they will necessarily just confine their inspection to that. They may very well expand it. Also, once they have inspected, there's a follow-up and evaluation. There's a mandatory follow-up inspection where a citation for overexposure has been issued. And if that follow-up is not possible because the operation is concluded, then a written documentation of abatement efforts must be provided by the employers who were cited. So these are all part of the discussion when we're talking about inspections. Beyond that, where exposure limits cannot be reduced below the permissible exposure level, they're going to be looking for engineering and administrative controls. Those engineering and administrative controls must be used to reduce the exposures as low as possible. Respiratory protection must be used to supplement other controls. The abatement verification data, once something has been done about a silica situation and has been successfully abated, the verification data is going to be used then by the Office of Statistics as well, so that they can see how things are going. What are some of the possible ways to reduce exposure? Well, one of the perhaps more difficult ways is to substitute materials that don't have any crystalline silica in them. That may be rather difficult, but that's one way. To locate employees as far away as possible from any dust generation source. And then either isolate the employees or isolate the source from which the silica dust is being generated by means of either control rooms or enclosures or barriers, or there's various options that we have there to try to control that. Now, other possible ways to reduce exposures to use local exhaust ventilation or tools with dust collecting systems. Now, having said that, we need probably at this point to talk about HEPA vacs and that sort of thing. When we're talking about tools with dust collecting systems, there's a table that's put out by OSHA called Table 1, and it shows how much exposure a person is able to have in a given period of time. And having said that, the way that you can follow Table 1 is what's called Table 1. The way that you can follow that is by using tools with dust collecting systems. Now, various manufacturers have these kinds of compliant tools. They typically tend to be called HEPA vacs or dust collection systems like that. You can also use wet methods. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But my point is that if you're going to do the kind of drilling that we do, and we as a company purchase these OSHA compliant tools, we follow Table 1 so that we reduce the amount of exposure that our employees have to silica dust. So where you need to be aware is that there is, in our company, a means of you successfully navigating the situation where you're being exposed to silica by using the compliant tools that we supply for you. We also do supply the training for that so that you can use them successfully and safely. So that's another way to reduce the exposure to silica, is these tools with dust collecting systems. Also wet methods. We do some core drilling from time to time, especially when we're installing handrail. We use a particular brand, and into that brand of core drill is incorporated a wet system. Now, that accomplishes a couple of things. It keeps the dust down. That's part of what it does. And also, because these are drilling into concrete, the water acts as a lubricant so that the core drill, will operate properly and be able to cut through the concrete. So that accomplishes kind of two things at the same time. So that's one way, a possible way to reduce exposure, is use a wet method when cutting or chipping or drilling or sawing or grinding. If you are cleaning surfaces, you want to clean those surfaces with either EpiVac or with wet sweeping, composition type sweeping, so that you can accomplish a cleaning up without having to use, say, for example, compressed air. The years gone by, people used to very commonly use compressed air to blow off the slab or to clean an area. That's because of the new legislation. That's not a possibility anymore. Other ways are respiratory protection. There's a couple of choices there. The thing with respiratory protection is that an individual who's going to use a mask, for example, and in this particular case, in the construction context, a bandana won't work, really. That's not really going to be satisfactory to keep this kind of dust out. So if a person's going to have to use respiratory protection, then that individual has to have a medical examination, physical examination, has to have be trained to use the respiratory protection that's being provided. We have to purchase that for you. You have to, for example, be clean shaven so that you can get a seal in order for you to be able to successfully use it and it to be effective. There's a monitoring process. It's quite an involved process. The other alternative is perhaps air monitoring. Air monitoring has its difficulties by virtue of expense, and also by virtue of the fact that you cannot always use the information that you got on one day under certain conditions to be applied to another day when the conditions are not the same as they were on the day that you had the air monitored. What we have chosen to do here is we have chosen to follow Table 1, use the compliant tools, and that has so far been successful in allowing us to reduce our exposure to silica.